In this video, I'm going to show you some ways to get your circular saw to behave more like a miter saw. And to do this, I'm really going to show you how to build a simple, slightly experimental jig that you probably haven't seen before. I call it the radial cradle, and it only took about an hour to make. And off the bat, I'll say that I would normally rip all my components for this with a table saw and probably just knock the whole thing together from spare plywood. But many people don't have a table saw. So I'm actually going to focus on using store-bought materials and just a circular saw because I like to preach circular saw reliance, especially for people on a budget. So what I went with is actually a little bit of pine trim lumber and also particle board. I normally don't use this stuff, but it's so cheap. And even more important, it has a nice straight edge because it's manufactured and has no grain to warp. MDF might have been an option as well, but it's heavier and the dust is awful. And remember that if you're still learning about materials and tools, be sure to check out our Ultimate Carpentry Checklist. It's a free interactive ebook detailing every important thing there is to know about carpentry, including tools, materials, concepts, and more. You can check off the things you know and click on the items you don't know to learn all about them. It's totally free and you can get it in the link down below. So to start the build, I just cut the melamine and 4 of the 1x2s down to 6 feet. Notice I'm just using a rafter square as a guide, which is a great technique in most cases. But it's more tedious for angled cuts, and it really doesn't work at all for certain trim pieces with shaped edges, which is why I'm building the cradle to begin with. So I make my first cuts, then I start gluing and shooting the 1x2s into simple rails. Then I spread glue on the inner faces of the rails, drop the melamine sheet down onto the glue beds, and just shoot the rails tight to the panel, relying on the straight edge of the panel to create straightness in our other components. Now, for a typical cradle jig, I would just create short sections of guide rail and shoot or screw them onto the cradle frame at a perfect 90 degrees. If I set them just a hair wider than the width of the sole plate, then they act as a great guide for the circular saw. And the curve that the saw makes through that guide also becomes a sight lineup for your cut. Just mark your cut point with the tick, place it right at the curve on the sidewall, and easily pass your saw through that location. You can even prevent tear out by holding a backer piece to the far edge. Or if you're more confident lining up by eye, you can press it to the far wall and make your cut there. Either way, you just want to be sure you're bracing the board firmly to prevent movement. That's very important. And you could also do the exact same thing with the rail set to 45 degrees. You just want to be sure that you're leaving enough rail overhang that you can set your saw fully outside the cradle frame when you start. Otherwise, it's the same process, and you can once again use the rafter square to set your angle. But I thought a fully adjustable rail guide would be even cooler because it would let you cut multiple angles at will. So to create that, I just made this 4-foot rail guide. I picked the straightest 1x2s to make the rail brackets and attached them with end pieces to keep them at a set distance apart. And I designated the straightest side as the guide side. I'll press the saw against this side to make sure it's running true. I don't want it wavering. To mount the guide, I left enough overhang that I could set the saw down fully outside of the cradle. Then I pre-drilled, countersunk, and attached the lower guide rail with just 1 screw. This will act as a pivot. From there, I began using my large rafter square to mark angles, starting with 90 degrees. I just scribed with the pencil along the leading edge of the guide. Then I rotated the square on its pivot and started marking other positions. Here you see how you can read the gauged markings on the bottom leg of the square, with the other leg pressed firmly to the edge of the rail guide. I just marked every 5-degree angle from 0 to 60. Then I started holding the guide down at these marks and pre-drilling holes in the lower rail. I was rushing here, just doing this by hand, and that was a mistake because you can see my drill bit wandering a little, which threw my angles off a tiny bit. Clamping really would have been a good idea to prevent this, but it's just a prototype, so I forged ahead and began pre-drilling at all of my marked locations. I also then went ahead and marked all of the various angles with a Sharpie. Then, I countersunk all the pilot holes I had just drilled. When all that prep work was done, I drove a screw at every location. I then screwed the guide down in several locations and ran some first cuts through. This was really just for me to visualize the full cut paths. So, I figured I'd try out the jig. One of the small issues with this design is that you do lose your nice little sightline notch at the front edge. It just gets blown out by kerf. But you can still easily see your cut mark if you make a tick, and that's what I lined up on. This is not an easy thing to film, but you can see how I spied it through my usual cut window for a kerf to the right cut. Then I was just careful to keep my board pulled towards the near edge and firmly braced. Again, I do not want the saw pushing it away. That's very important. You can maybe even think up some way to clamp this. Otherwise, I just drove the cut like a normal circular saw cut. This piece wasn't too bad. I was off about 0.2 of a degree, which I'm pretty sure was due to the drill bit wandering. So I set up for my 45-degree angle, made a cut, and this time was pleased to find that I was dead on accurate, like perfect. And that was after rushing much of this process. I then recorded myself making some random trim cuts, and much to my chagrin, somehow deleted all of that footage, and then cut up my rail guide because I thought I was done with it. That was my second big mistake. I thought I'd just make a new one and it would work out fine, but the thing is, all of those little holes are in extremely specific places, and there's kind of no way to recreate the guide locations without rebuilding everything. I already have a miter saw though, and I'd already proven to my satisfaction that this thing works pretty well. So there you have it, the lone existing cut footage of this radial cradle jig in all its short-lived glory. I think that this is pretty cool, and again, you could modify it in any way you see fit. You just want to be really precise with your drilled hole locations, and I think you've got a winner. What do you think of this idea? Would you use it? Let me hear about it down in the comments. And be sure to pick up your copy of the Ultimate Carpentry Checklist in the links below, or visit us at thehonestcarpenter.com to see what other great free things we have. As always, thanks for watching, and I hope you'll consider subscribing. I'm Ethan James with thehonestcarpenter.com. I'll see you next time.